Well, I think that we should open this up to the audience. Let me see where there's a hand up. Yes, right there. There's one coming right over there.
Thank you very much. John Cook from City UK. I've been very interested by listening to this discussion because this is really a comment that I'll be interested in what the panel members say. It seems to me that discussion is ranging in a way which suggests that that we're not actually just asking for the Doha round to be relaunched in some way. There's a considerable degree of both underlap and overlap with the scope of the Doha round. On the one hand, there's been an awful lot of talk of supply chains, and yet no one has mentioned the negotiations on trade facilitation around, which actually would certainly solve a number of the problems for goods. And from what's been said, arguably the trade facilitation discussions ought to be extended to facilitating trade in services, particularly electronic services. I mean, this is an area that's relevant. That is where I think there's a degree of underlap with the range of discussion that is actually taking place in Geneva. Of overlap. Where I think there's underlap is that when we get onto such questions as, say, electronic embassies, we're, I think, almost dealing with something completely new that doesn't actually correspond to a concept in the general agreement on trading services at all. I mean, I looked at Hamid Mandoor for a comment on this, but I can see looking ahead, we in the services industries will have to think quite carefully what we are actually asking for in terms of institutional progress in the WTO. So it seems to me, because of the range.
So that was part of the comment, but I think that there was a question or two there, which is in regards to the issue of the data embassies, while there may not be a specific part of the GATS agreements that explicitly talk to it, there are general provisions about least restrictive regulation and a series of other things that may start to frame the parameters of that as we move forward. But let me turn to the issue of trade facilitation. And maybe, Scott, in some ways I could ask you about that, because trade facilitation, in a sense, is also part of the issue that you're talking about creating these complementarities and multipliers.
Well, I think a lot of it is, earlier there was a discussion about the regulatory environment, and when you look at trade facilitation, you're talking about the ports, customs clearance, alignment of codes, and all these sorts of things. And it is critical, quite honestly, that progress is made on this, because supply chains are more effective when the efficient domestic supply chains are hooked up to an efficient international supply chain. And I think that the whole idea of trade facilitation is technical enough that there is probably not a broad understanding, and it may go into the too hard bucket. But I think without it, there won't be much progress. You see within ASEAN, you see within the EU that there's been progress made in more of a bilateral manner. But I think in terms of the multilateral, there's a huge amount of wastage of value that goes into the current system. So I would agree. I think trade facilitation needs to be an important part of this.
It's also heartening in a sense that when you go back to Seattle, trade facilitation was controversial.
Everything was controversial.
And at this point, it is something that there's a strong area of consensus on, right? So, next question, please. Yes.
Thank you very much. Hamid Mandoor from the WTO. I think I will make a comment first and then I'll ask a question to the panel. The comment is, when we look at services, the reality is that we're dealing today with a part of the world economy that is far more liberal than what is being negotiated. That's a reality. Which means actually that the driving force behind liberalization is not so much in trade negotiations, but it's always out of self-interest. And regulators and policymakers liberalize because they know that liberalization can produce efficiency gains. Now, I come to the question, while the situation is as liberal as it is, there is reluctance to bind that level of liberalization. And so often that relates to regulatory concerns. The regulators very jealously protect their sovereignty. There are so many problems that have arisen over the years that the solutions to which seem to lie in some degree of regulatory collaboration. Now, in the WTO, we've dealt with that to some extent in the basic telecommunications sector by members agreeing to a set of regulatory principles. There is that mechanism within the services agreement. I think John's question earlier related to that. It's a framework, legal framework in which members can negotiate whatever commitments they want. Apart from the traditional market access and national treatment, you come in, you will be treated on a non-discriminatory basis. But in addition to that, in some sectors, it is important to lay down certain regulatory principles. We did that in telecommunications, including, for example, the establishment of an independent regulator, the transparency of licensing procedures, the conditions for interconnection, taking reasonable measures to protect and safeguard competition. Because if you liberalize and you don't have competition, then you don't have an efficient market. Now, my question to you is, to what extent, since you operate globally, do you see that more regulatory collaboration, even through evolving the negotiating agenda within the DDA or outside the DDA, but if the negotiating agenda deals more and more with these regulatory problems, do you find that this can open the way for your businesses to operate better? Thank you.
Let me take a quick cut at that first on this. I would agree with everything you said, and I think John's comment on, if we're really going to get at this as part of the Doha round, it just may be too large to try to do between now and whatever that is to be done. We obviously in the financial sector have a lot of discussion about regulatory cooperation. And as this crisis, global crisis, eases, the challenge will be to see whether anything really comes out of that. We hope and soul, obviously, something specific. We've seen Basel move and our regulators move in consort with the decisions made 2 weeks ago. So I think in our area there is great cooperation going on. Now the big challenge, to be frank with you, will be as the crisis eases, will they continue that sense of cooperation? It hasn't happened in the past, usually, so it's a big challenge.
Well, I think a regulatory framework is very important, especially when we're opening the services trade. Telecom is one great example that you have referred to. As we also go into the international markets, you'll find it that at least the framework is quite established on this. But if you have to go into the other areas, and mostly the developing countries which have yet to open those sectors, I think it's quite very important to see that the regulatory mechanism is in place. So that the arbitrary work of the governments of the day is much lessened, and you know the level playing fields, you know the framework that you're working in. So I think being from telecom industry, I can clearly see that that has set a benchmark. Most of the countries have followed that, barring a couple of countries which need to fall in line. But net, I think that's a way forward for other industries as well.
I think, you wouldn't want to weigh down the negotiations with a regulatory debate. I think you would end up paralyzed. But I think that the regulatory environment will be